Thank you for joining us for another Hagley History Hangout. My name is Gregory Hargreaves, Assistant Director of the Center for the History of Business, Technology, and Society at the Hagley Museum and Library in Wilmington, Delaware. Now, during these history hangouts, we like to bring you some of the great work being done by folks who have used the historical collections held in the Hagley Library, especially scholars who have received support in the form of research grants and fellowships of different kinds from the Hagley Center. One such scholar joins me today. Dr. Laura Browder is professor at the University of Richmond. Laura, thanks for speaking with me today.
Thanks for having me, Greg.
Oh, you're very welcome. Let's start by painting with broad strokes, so to speak. What is it you are researching and writing about?
I am authoring a book with my collaborator, Ryan Steele, who is a sociologist at Miami University in Ohio, about the history of drug testing in America called Chemical Citizenship. And we were really interested in the question of how did we get to this place in the US, which drug tests more people than any other nation per capita, where you the level of drugs or the lack thereof in your blood determines whether you get to keep your baby, keep your job, stay out of the incarceral system, etc. Compete in sports. So these are some big questions. And
Hmm.
I was really excited to come to the Hagley because of your National Association of Manufacturers archives, which are immense and very thoroughly document the rise of mandated workplace drug testing, which was started under Ronald Reagan.
I see. Well, what is the temporal scope of your study?
We start out in the 1930s with two stories. One is the rise of the drunkometer, which was the predecessor to the breathalyzer we know today. And this became a huge public health campaign because up until that point, it was very difficult to convict people of drunken driving, even when they killed people, because they could just say, sure, I drank 2 bottles of whiskey in the car, but I didn't feel drunk. I was fine. And so suddenly you had a machine, and its use was very controversial at first, that could determine blood alcohol levels. And when the government in various state governments set the limits for how much alcohol you could have in your blood, um, they set it at something like 8 drinks, right? So significantly higher than it is now. So 0.15. So that's a lot of alcohol, but they kept the level that high, the permissible level, because they didn't want people to freak out over the idea that their breath could be tested. And there were a lot of court cases about, did this violate your right to privacy? And the answer was often yes. So courts battled this out for a while. And then the other really significant story of the 1930s has to do with Harry Anslinger, who was the first head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, which was founded in 1930. And before this, Anslinger had been a Prohibition Bureau official, and he knew, as well as anyone else, just how unpopular prohibition was and how little Americans liked having people tell them what they could drink or ingest in other ways, right? So he came up with a genius idea to help boost funding and personnel and popularity for his agency. And this was focusing on heroin addicted racehorses, of all things, because at this time, racehorses were routinely doped to either make them speed up or slow down, depending on which way someone wanted the betting to go. And so, Black Beauty had been published in the US a few decades earlier, and horses were now seen as feeling, caring animals. And because of this, Anslinger was able to say, hey, we really need to protect these poor horses who are being victimized. They're junkies, right? And he worked with reporters to create stories about these poor horses whose lives were being destroyed. And most important of all, because this is an era of eugenics, right? And so he said that heroin would destroy horses' ability to breed. So they would, if they were female, they would give birth to stillborn um, babies, foals. And if they were male, they would become sterile. So in this way, he managed to appeal to multiple audiences at once and got, no, excuse me, saliva testing approved at race courses. And, you know, this had happened in Europe decades earlier. We were very slow to catch up, but there we were. So he got this instituted. And again, people forget now, but doping racehorses was a really big plot point in a lot of Hollywood movies, including the one that made Shirley Temple famous, Little Miss Marker, right? So people were very aware of it. It was something that was being publicly debated, and Anslinger used drug testing, sending undercover FBN agents to race tracks around the country where they worked as trainers or in other capacities. And he used this to help promote his agency and, of course, his budget.
Hmm. So some really important themes were present in the history of drug testing right from the first. So we have things like
Absolutely.
sport, we have things like law enforcement, um, we have a whole number of things that then follow the story through to the present day. Am I onto something there?
You are absolutely onto something. And, one of the questions that Ryan and I have been grappling with is who gets tested and why?
Hmm.
And how are they presented to the public? For example, in sports, doping in sports had been common since, well, the beginning of the 20th century or earlier. And by around 1970, a number of professional athletes were actually writing autobiographies where they talked about being forced to take drugs by their team doctor or their coach or the team owner. So this is something they didn't want to do, particularly amphetamine. In the NFL, which started being televised, games were televised from the early 60s and on, and football was understood to be a kind of gladiator-like game, violent, all about violent masculinity and a proxy for war. And so team doctors would give their players amphetamine to make them more violent. And then, of course, painkillers, because when they were taking amphetamine, they didn't always realize that they had been injured. So this became something that professional athletes began protesting against. I mean, we now think of doping as something that athletes themselves want to do. But back then, there were some who liked being doped, but there were others who really resisted it. So that's one part of the story. And the way that workplace testing became normalized is another really interesting story because it started before Reagan, and the people in the workplace who were being tested were soldiers in the Vietnam War. So by 1971, the military had been very concerned in the late 1960s that troops deployed to Vietnam were smoking a lot of cannabis. And so they created a lot of cannabis prevention programs. And of course, we all know marijuana has a very distinctive smell. So GIs who wanted to make their time pass more quickly turned first to opium and then to heroin. And, we've all heard about the golden triangle in Asia, for manufacturing and shipping heroin. This actually developed in response to the demand from GIs for heroin, because most Asians, if they consumed opium, smoked it and used it in a less processed form. But the GIs really wanted heroin that they could sprinkle in their cigarettes, right? Smoke undetected, snort, or inject. And so a moral panic developed around the idea that these, GI junkies, as they were called, would be coming home to the United States and turning into criminals to support their habits because heroin was very, very cheap in Vietnam and much more expensive in the United States. And up to this point, the government officials had demonized heroin as a black inner city drug. And now they saw that white working class kids would become addicted. And so Nixon instituted what was called the Golden Flow Program of urinalysis, right, to test all GIs before they returned home. Of course, there were a lot of reasons for him doing this, and one of them, a big one, was public outrage over the My Lai massacre and outrage over other war crimes committed by Americans in Vietnam that had come to light. And so instead of people seeing GIs as war criminals and depraved, he wanted the public to see them as victims of communists who were getting them addicted to heroin so that they could, destroy their fighting abilities. Of course, there were all kinds of problems with this scenario, right? Starting with the fact that most of the GIs were not using heroin when they were out fighting, but rather they were using it as a way of making their year-long deployments move more quickly, right? So you have GIs, in oral history interviews that they subsequently did, talking about how before the advent of heroin, there were the juicers and the heads, right? And juicers were the alcoholics, and heads were those who used weeds. And the juicers were characterized by the fact that they were white, they were generally racist and self-segregating, and they were more violent. Whereas once GIs started using heroin, they were able to create interracial social groups and kind of improve the conditions of their lives. And far from staying addicted and becoming criminals when they returned home, almost all of them were able to give up heroin as soon as they got back home, which really led a lot of addiction researchers to begin wondering, what does this all mean?
Mhm.
So Nixon starts this, and soon a few businesses are interested in implementing it. And you start seeing news articles and op-ed pieces with titles like Chemical McCarthyism, decrying this trend. But it wasn't until Reagan came into office that the efforts really amped up. And again, there had been whole industries like trucking that depended on having workers who were using drugs. And at congressional hearings in the early 70s, truckers spoke out about this, saying our work conditions are so bad that the only way we can, make our routes and make our times is by not sleeping and staying on amphetamine all the time, right? That we're out working. And they hated this. They called it a slow motion suicide. But now Reagan had to go from persuading Americans that drugs were not something that you took to work better or faster, but that taking drugs instead uh, cheated your workmates, your colleagues, and your boss. So he really had to implement a shift in public consciousness. And initially, most businesses were not behind this effort at all, right? They resisted. Drug testing was expensive, it was unreliable. And with the catch and release plan, as people in the industry call it, once you discovered that someone had drugs in their system, you had to fire them. So this led to the rise of employment assistance programs, EAPs, right? Which provided help to employees who tested positive for drugs. But there were plenty of problems with this, right? For one thing, cannabis stays in your system for weeks and weeks. So if you smoked a joint a month ago and were tested today, you could come up positive, right? And that created all kinds of problems for both employees and employers. And interestingly enough, now that cannabis has been legalized in many states, it's created a huge problem for a lot of employers. Because, for example, if you drive a truck, the the Department of Transportation mandates that you have all these regular drug tests. So if you've ever seen an Amazon truck, which we all have, you might be surprised to learn that they are actually not defined as trucks. Amazon used a very technical loophole to avoid that classification because if they were classified as trucks, Amazon would not be able to hire any drivers, right? Because so many people use cannabis now.
Mhm.
Frequently or infrequently, it doesn't really matter because it would show up on the test if they did. So we're kind of at a very interesting moment for drug testing.
Quite. Well, another sort of dark thread running through this whole history is eugenics. And you touched on that briefly in the example of racehorses, but it seems that
Absolutely.
that has nevertheless stuck with drug testing over the 20th century, well into the 21st. So could you perhaps unpack that a little bit for us?
Absolutely. A lot of the demonization of recreational drug use in the US has been geared towards fears of interracial sex, right? Um, the weakening of the white race, if I can put it that bluntly, right? The idea that people who took drugs would somehow their genetic uh, powers would be lessened. That if you were white and started taking drugs, you would somehow become a person of color, right? And you see this in early shock movies like Reefer Madness, right? You would become, women would become promiscuous, men would become sexually violent, and everyone would be more on board with integration, right? So all of these fears around communism and civil rights, right, all get expressed in the discourse around drug testing, which is, I think, such a fascinating idea. And, it is routine for women to be drug tested without their knowledge when they give birth. And if they come up positive, again, they might have had a little marijuana a month ago, their baby can be taken away from them.
And that gets to sort of the name of the project about chemical citizenship, where your rights become pegged to the chemical composition of your blood.
Absolutely. And in the US, we subscribe to this idea much more than in any other country in the world. And that's interesting to me too, because we're getting mixed messages, right? One message that we're getting is you have to succeed at all costs. And that's why drugs have been so popular for so many groups or so frequently used. Whether you're a trucker, if you are a factory worker, right? And your assembly line has been sped up and you need to keep up with that, right? If you're a shift worker and you've got unpredictable shifts and you might be called in as truckers were, for example, after 8 hours of rest, right? And then called onto the road again, right? There are so many reasons that people take drugs, including, of course, the fact that people take drugs to get high and to make their boring jobs seem less boring, right? Or their stressful jobs seem less stressful, as soldiers were doing in Vietnam, right? For both of those reasons, boredom, extreme stress, moral injury, all of those things, it contributed to a climate where GIs really wanted to find a way to keep their equilibrium and not go crazy. And for a lot of them, heroin was that, right? But again, it's a very mixed message because one of the ways that GIs would game the test is by taking government prescribed barbiturates before they were tested, because they could then say, well, this positive result is because of drugs the military gave me. The military was giving them enormous amounts of barbiturates and amphetamines, right, to enhance their performance. So where do we draw the line?
Hmm. Now, I'd like to hear a little bit more about what you found at Hagley. I know you said you were mainly focused on the NAM, National Association of Manufacturer records. What did you find in there?
It was the mother lode because, and in fact, right now, Ryan is supervising a team of 6 undergraduate research students at Miami University who are pouring through and classifying these records, because you see both the reaction of labor unions, right? What does it mean that all workers can be tested? This is an invasion of privacy, right? You see the pushback from manufacturers. This is going to be prohibitively expensive, and we don't want to lose great employees, right, because of this. And you also see a lot of congressional records dealing with these questions. So it was very much in the public consciousness, and it was something that Reagan had to really sell hard if he could reframe the drug use that was routine for many Americans. I mean, I just finished writing a book about amphetamines, right, in America from 1945 to 1973. By 1970, and records are a little soft, right? There were a lot of different estimates, but the lowest estimate for legal domestic production of amphetamines in 1970 was 8 billion doses a year. That's the lowest, and they went up from there, right?
Wow.
So it's pretty shocking. And, barbiturates were also very widely used. And of course, there was illegal production of all kinds of drugs. So you know, the US in the 20th and 21st century has always been a leader in drug consumption as well as in drug testing, right? So here we are.
Hmm.
It's
Well,
schizophrenic.
mhm. Well, Laura, it's a really interesting topic, and I genuinely look forward to reading your book when you're all done.
Thank you so much, Greg, and thank you so much for having me.
Oh, you're very welcome. And for the audience, if you would like more Hagley History Hangouts and more information on the Center for the History of Business, Technology, and Society at the Hagley Museum and Library, join us online. You can visit hagley.org. That's HAGLEY.org. Don't be a stranger.